welcome to the Angry Habs Fan Podcast Show. It is October 23rd, Sunday, 2016, broadcasting to you live from Montreal, Quebec, Canada. Fall is here, the leaves are falling in heaps. We turned on our heat like many Canadians this week. Definitely a sign that winter is coming. Been talking a lot of Habs to my friends this week, and every time we talk about the Habs, we talk about their future, and every time we talk about their future, we end up talking about Carey Price. We end up talking about his contract, whether he'll sign, whether he'll re-sign, whether we'll trade him. So this is a podcast I've been wanting to do for a while. So that'll be the first segment this week. And of course, we have the good, bad, and ugly, which will cover mostly what happened this week with the Habs. Of course, the Habs right now are tied in first in the NHL. They're doing great. They won all their games this week. So, it's a lot of good this week in the good, bad, and ugly. But as always, there's some bad and ugly. So this week, let's move into the first segment, the franchise's future, Carey Price. And Carey Price is the franchise player of the Montreal Canadiens. How Carey Price does is how the Montreal Canadiens do, whether it be present, past, or future, quite frankly. His contract ends in 2018. So we have him signed for 2 more years, this year and next year. This means, in my opinion, that the Montreal Canadiens should be planning their next move right now as far as Carey Price and as far as the franchise goes. Because whatever happens with Carey Price will determine our future in the biggest of ways. So what is the next move with Carey Price and the situation with his contract? Well, personally, I'm not sure. I would be remiss not to mention his family situation. As we all know, he's a West Coast boy. He's married to a West Coast girl who's from Washington State. They have a kid. During the off season, he spends his time in Kelowna, BC. So the discussion of his West Coast connections are definitely legitimate and a concern of Montreal Canadiens fans. Is this enough for him to leave the Montreal Canadiens and go play in the West? Well, that is what is up for discussion. Things that could make Carey Price leave the Montreal Canadiens is that desire to live out west near his family. And let's be frank, the desire to win the Stanley Cup. If in the next 2 years he feels that the Montreal Canadiens aren't any closer to winning a Stanley Cup, he may decide to leave and go to a team where he feels he has a better chance. The future can only tell for that one. However, that could easily happen. However, before we speak of that, let's talk about the signing possibilities, which are the most hopeful ones for the Montreal Canadiens fans. And of course, I think the contract extension is our best option, I should say. Get as many years out of him as possible at the least possible price. Now, on discussing that with my friends, I think Montreal Canadiens fans, if we're going to pay the bill, and we might have to, should get ready to pay $9 to $10 million a year for the best goalie in the NHL. When PK Subban got $9 million a year, it turned a lot of heads, and I think Carey Price can easily say that he's at least worth PK Subban's contract. And he would be right. The Montreal Canadiens, there are a lot of tax situations too that Carey Price has to keep in mind when he starts making that much money. And the Montreal Canadiens might have to pay that extra bit to cover the tax he's going to lose by continuing to play in Canada. We have to say that because obviously if he were to move to the West Coast, personally, I don't see him playing in Vancouver. I don't think he's interested in going to a team that is worse than the Montreal Canadiens, frankly. However, if you told me he could go to Anaheim, San Jose, LA, they have Quick, so I don't quite see that happening. But, those are 2 teams on the West Coast that might interest him, that are easily better than the Montreal Canadiens today and might be in 2 years. So the contract extension for all of us is the best possible outcome here. If that's the case, it has to start happening now, in my opinion. The parties have to get together and start talking of that possibility. because if Carey Price isn't interested in a contract extension, then the Montreal Canadiens have to start thinking about what might be their next move. On that vein, the signing, one of the worst options would be to run out his contract and be in a situation of having to sign him to a new contract, not knowing, what will happen if he doesn't sign. Well, knowing what will happen is that we get nothing in return. We would just lose the player and he would go sign with a new team. Now, I dismiss this because I don't think the Montreal Canadiens are that reckless. I think the Montreal Canadiens want to resolve this at latest the beginning of next year. If there's no movement, then other options will have to be explored, which we will explore in a second. And, we'll explore them now, to be honest. The other possibility is we trade him. And if we trade him, it could be at any time, frankly. It could be this year even. If we get the right pieces for an offer for Carey Price, and Carey Price shows no interest in returning to the Montreal Canadiens, then I don't see why we shouldn't go ahead and do it, starting from today till next year. What pieces could those be? Well, that's definitely up for discussion. I guess you'd have to decide whether you want to continue to try to be a winning team in the present or if you want to be a winning team in the future. And we'll be discussing the rebuild options in a couple of seconds because that is one of the options. However, we'll continue discussing about what options we can get for the present. And for me, if we were to trade Carey Price, I would love to see us get a great center. A center that's, a first-line center, which would bump Galchenyuk down to the second line, I understand. But if Galchenyuk is our second line center, our front end has been greatly improved. And Plekanec then would be our third line center, and so on and so forth. I would be very interested in that move. The last 10 years, the Stanley Cup winners have been teams that have had big centers. Undeniable. Each team has had, if not one or two lines of big centers, and oftentimes not necessarily with an all-star goalie. As far as that goes, yes, having an all-star goalie helps when you're doing your Stanley Cup run, but a lot of the times it ends up being really the goalies that are the hottest at that moment, that could play the best during that month of hockey, and is regardless of their status of their play in the NHL. Now, of course, an all-star goalie ups your chances to advance because they are a better goalie, so, they might be able to steal a game or two for you. But in the end, the two Stanley Cup fighters are usually teams that have the two goalies that are playing their best. Now, there's even been times where Stanley Cup teams have had goalies that have been playing, frankly, not that well. We've seen teams make it to the finals, substituting goalies, and that kind of thing. So, there's even a debate to be had about the impact of goalies in playoffs. Maybe I'll do a podcast in the future. So, by trading Carey Price, I think is what I'm getting at, does not necessarily mean that we are giving up on the Stanley Cup. I think by trading Carey Price, we could easily still be a Stanley Cup team. The pieces we could get in return could be a mixture of things that help us in the present and the future, could be things that help us only in the present, but that doesn't negate our chance for a Stanley Cup. Now, I would be remiss not to mention who could replace Carey Price. Now, of course, we could get something back in return in a trade that is less than Carey Price, but is still good. But I think when you have a guy like Fucale in the minors, who, in my opinion, will be NHL ready in 2 to 3 years, it could be a good idea to start preparing him in that scenario so that we can focus on improving the front of our team. And if we do that and Fucale does come up and play decent hockey for us, we could easily set ourselves up for a continued playoff presence for many, many years to come. So the future is not bleak for the Montreal Canadiens goaltending situation. It's not like we lose Carey Price and we have absolutely nothing else behind us, or we pick up a Jocelyn Thibault, if you will, to sort of plug the gap. We don't necessarily have to go down that route. So, those are the sort of what could happen if we traded Carey Price. However, if we traded Carey Price for draft picks and young players, then we kind of move into the idea of rebuilding. And when you're talking about rebuilding, you're talking about two ways to rebuild, really. There's the long-term way, a la Toronto Maple Leafs. I think the Toronto Maple Leafs are on a minimum 4-year rebuild plan here. This is their second year. Second, yeah. So, and they're continuing to rebuild. I don't see them winning much this year, even though they have Austin Matthews. But let's all admit as Habs fans, what the Toronto Maple Leafs are doing is extremely worrying. They, in 2 to 3 years maximum, in my opinion, will be a formidable team. They are definitely on a trajectory to be a Stanley Cup contender. And that is extremely bad news for Montreal Canadiens fans. And if Toronto becomes a Stanley Cup contender and the Montreal Canadiens are sort of still floundering in mediocrity or just, hoping for playoff miracles, then I think the fans might get a little fed up. However, if we have Carey Price and we're still trying to push for the cup, we'll see. The future can only tell. But the long-term rebuild idea for the Montreal Canadiens, I don't think is a good one. And I'll explain why. Simply in the fact that we have too many players right now that are about to enter their prime. Galchenyuk, Gallagher, even Pacioretty, you could argue, Beaulieu, and there's just too many players that are entering that prime that we would have to essentially get rid of to get more young pieces, and we would have to strip our team. And I don't think Montreal Canadiens fans could handle that. I know I couldn't. I would hate to see Galchenyuk go. Not to mention to watch 4 to 5 years of brutal hockey while we pick up pieces trying to rebuild a dynasty team. I think that option is probably the most unpleasant for Montreal Canadiens fans. Don't get me wrong, if we were to go down that road and we did pick up dynasty pieces, it would put us in a Chicago Blackhawks situation, if you will. So in the long term, that would be beautiful, but I don't think in the short and medium term the franchise could take it, if you will. Which I think leads us to the second best option, and that would be the mini rebuild. And a mini rebuild essentially is you'd give yourself 2, maybe 3 years maximum. You keep players that are entering their prime. You let go of veterans that in 2 to 3 years are essentially you're aiming for Stanley Cup contention in 2 to 3 years. That would be an interesting option for the Montreal Canadiens if we were to trade Carey Price for younger pieces. That way we keep Galchenyuk, we keep Gallagher, we keep Beaulieu, et cetera, et cetera. We have a lot of young players coming up that I think are going to be fixtures on the team in 2 to 3 years. The youngsters coming up are interesting. So as far as that goes, a mini rebuild, I would not be opposed to it. Not to mention, I don't think Hab fans would be opposed to it either. I think it could be sold, especially with the idea that this will make us a real Stanley Cup contender. Again, the hunt for that big center, whether it be a starter in today's lineup or a future prospect, the mini rebuild doesn't necessarily guarantee that. Simply because you're keeping enough assets that make you a good enough team that the first pick overall is not necessarily guaranteed. You might be looking at picking in the bottom, but, if you're not picking first, second, or third, sometimes there's those years where the assets become a little more scattered and harder to pick and can quite frankly fail. So, the mini rebuild for me, I'm not quite interested in that either. I'll be honest with you. I don't think we're in a great position to do a mini rebuild. I don't like the idea of finishing 7th or 8th, towards the bottom. picking players that are possibilities and not guarantees. I think Montreal Canadiens fans just don't really want to deal with that. I think the best move for Carey Price, myself personally, is either, of course, we keep him, sign him to a contract extension, give him what he needs, and continue to push to build the better team and to compete each year, or we trade him, but we trade him to compete in the present and not in the future necessarily. We try to trade him for that big center. We try to trade him for maybe a big winger. At least a couple of pieces, in my opinion, when you're trading the best goalie in the NHL. Maybe a center first pick, second pick. If you go down the line, there's a lot of positives that could come out of trading Carey Price. And I know this terrifies Habs fans. It terrifies me too. But if this is done properly, and I know people might disagree with this, it actually might make us a better team. I know we've lived in Montreal with the idea that we have to always have the best goalie or striving to have the best goalie. And I'm not sure that's the proper or correct philosophy. I think you obviously have to try to get the best goalie at all times, but should that be your top priority as your franchise? That is what I'm questioning. Like I said before, you look at Stanley Cup pass winning teams and contenders, and they all have their forward lines are chocked full of players that, have been picked high, developed, sometimes bought, but there's no debating that their front lines are absolutely formidable. And if the Montreal Canadiens started to go down that vein, I would not be against that. So the future can only tell. And Carey Price, I would hope, is being open with the Montreal Canadiens on his plans. And I hope that the Montreal Canadiens are being open with him, whether we keep him or not. Because if we do end up trading him, I think Carey Price has earned the right to go where he wants. And I think the Montreal Canadiens have also earned the right to get what they want. And to do all that, it takes time. So that's why I'm discussing it today. When something takes time, I mean it takes sometimes a year and a half, and it has to start today. I would love to be a fly on that wall, listening to them discuss what the possible future is, because really we're talking about the future of our franchise. So that'll end this segment, and we'll move into the good, bad, and ugly.